This is one of a series of meetings that's been taking place across Scotland. Last week Wahid and my comrades from Glasgow came up to Aberdeen, where we did 2 meetings in the one day. We've had meetings in Dundee, Kirkcaldy, Musselburgh, Edinburgh. There's meetings this week in Cumbernauld and Livingston. And as part of the Scottish Socialist Party's effort to make clear to the people of Scotland, 70% of whom in the polls make it clear they're opposed to British soldiers being in Afghanistan, that there is at least one party that speaks in their behalf and it puts forward the case for bringing home the British soldiers who are there. And this issue of Britain's involvement in Afghanistan is an immensely important political issue. It's up there on a par, let's face it, with the worst economic recession that Britain has seen in 80 years. Because in Afghanistan, Britain has been occupying a country for nearly 9 years now. And as Wahid has pointed out, against the express wishes of the Afghan people who don't want them to be there. And in those 9 years, more than 50,000 innocent Afghan civilians have been killed. And in those circumstances, you have to ask yourself, how on earth does that make the world a safer place for the children of Afghanistan or the children here in Glasgow? The fact of the matter is, the importance of this issue is, for me, well understood by people across Britain. And across Scotland, people rightly shed a tear over the 260 young British servicemen who've been killed in the last 9 years in a pointless, senseless war that involves Britain occupying a country it doesn't want us to be there, and does enormous damage, quite frankly, to Britain's international reputation. And that's, for me, the reason why, across the length and breadth of Scotland, when the Scottish Socialist Party is campaigning and petitioning the matter, people will come up to you and make it clear that they're sick of what they see. They distance themselves from, first of all, Tony Blair's decision to invade that country way back in 2001, and the continuation of the same policy by Gordon Brown. And both my previous speakers have mentioned the latest British military operation, Operation Mushtarak. And I have to say, I was sitting watching, and it's, I think, an indication of the role that the media in Britain and Western media plays in conflicts, where you now hear of journalists being embedded. Have you heard that phrase, where journalists are embedded with the Ministry of Defence? And so all objectivity goes out the window, and you have episodes like you must have witnessed today if you watched the 1 o'clock news on the BBC, where 5 seconds, and I counted it on my watch, 5 seconds was given to the death of 27 innocent Afghan civilians blown to smithereens yesterday by the NATO forces who mistook them, in their words, for a Taliban convoy. Men, women and children blown to smithereens, 5 seconds in the 1 o'clock news, followed by an item, and honestly God, I don't make this up, 3 minutes long, of a policeman in court in England today for killing 2 Alsatian dogs in his car by leaving them in a car that was hot in the summer. And you have to say, it says a great deal about the values of the BBC, that 27 Afghan lives don't matter that much, and the lives of 2 Alsatian dogs, tragedies I'm sure it was, gets 3.5 minutes on the 1 o'clock news. And we have to be prepared to accept the fact and face the fact that in the course of the last 9 years, we have seen on television, and we've noted the deaths of young British soldiers being brought back from Afghanistan to the Wiltshire RAF base, and their coffin being paraded through Wootton Bassett. And I'm sure we did shed a tear 262 times. But what about the tears of 50,000 innocent Afghan civilians who blown to smithereens as a consequence of the decision that was taken in 2001 by Tony Blair and George Bush to go to war in Afghanistan on a lie? And I have to say, the circumstances, you know, the comparison between the deaths of the military and the deaths of ordinary Afghans, 10 times as many Afghans have now been killed as died in the 9/11 attack in America. And it seems to me we're in that similar circumstance that we've been in many times before, that when Britain and America and imperialist armies go to war, there is no mention of the innocents on the other side, who are 10, 20, 30, 50 times more have been killed than we see on our side. And it's absolutely my duty to put in front of you the fact, Wahid has already done it, there are 33 million Afghans who've made it clear, time after time after time, they don't want us to be there. They don't want British soldiers, American soldiers, Dutch soldiers, Canadian soldiers. They don't want them to be there. They want the chance to run their own lives. And that's something that I hope everybody in this room would grant them that right, see that right as theirs. Before Christmas, Joan Humphreys and I wrote to every single member of the Scottish Parliament, all 129 of them, to ask them whether they stood by the point of view of their constituents, who, as I mentioned in the poll, 70% of whom want to see British soldiers brought home from Afghanistan. We wrote to 129 and only 10 of them replied. In January we wrote to the 59 Westminster MPs who are responsible for conducting this war and asked them the same question. Where did they stand in Parliament and represent the 70% of their constituents who wanted to see Britain out of Afghanistan and the troops brought home? And only 6 of them bothered to reply. I ask you the question, do you ever get the impression that our representatives don't want to talk about something? And I'll tell you what I want to put in front of you, what they won't tell you. In other words, I feel obliged to put in front of you this evening the case that the warmongers who support Britain's involvement in Afghanistan put forward. They might not be willing to tell you, so I will. And the first point is that it's worth remembering in 2001, Tony Blair told us that Britain was invading Afghanistan on the coattails of America because Afghanistan was responsible for the 9/11 bombing in Washington DC and New York City. I remind you of that because, of course, in 2002, the focus of attention changed to Saddam Hussein. And it was Saddam Hussein, remember, who was responsible for the 9/11 bombings. And of course, just as Tony Blair was caught out at the Chalkit inquiry 2 weeks ago, has been proven as a liar, lying to us about the purpose of the war in Iraq, the same thing can be said about Afghanistan. There was not one single Afghan involved in the 9/11 bombing. And so you may ask yourself, the reasons they gave in the first place have turned out to be a lie. They then went on to say that no Afghanistan, there was no Afghans involved, but they were guilty of harbouring Osama Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda terrorists in the Bora Bora Mountains. And that was the reason later on that they gave for justifying the invasion. And of course we're then entitled to say, the Afghan people were responsible for harbouring Osama Bin Laden. Well, we've been there for 9 years with 100,000 soldiers, and we've not found Osama Bin Laden in Afghanistan. So does that mean that NATO is guilty of harbouring Osama Bin Laden as well? And of course it's a nonsense. But perhaps the biggest nonsense here, wrapped up in the excuses they gave, is to equate the Taliban with Al-Qaeda. And it's fair to say, as Wahid touched on it before, and Mohammed Asif has done at previous meetings, the Taliban, I have nothing to say good about the Taliban. The Taliban are reactionary Islamic fundamentalists for me. But it's fair to point out to this audience and others, the Taliban are essentially Pashtun nationalists who were in government in Afghanistan, largely as a consequence of the efforts of British and American intelligence in the 1980s, who overthrew the previous government in Afghanistan and helped to arm the Mujahideen fighters. That's how they got to be there. But the Taliban are passive. They're essentially Pashtun nationalists whose interest is only in that part of Afghanistan that borders Pakistan, where the Pashtun people live. They have nothing in common as an organisation with Al-Qaeda, who are in effect, Bin Laden is a Saudi national and Al-Qaeda are effectively international mercenaries. And what we've seen in fact in the last few months and weeks and years has been to conflate the Taliban with Al-Qaeda and to forget the fact that, as John Pilger, the award-winning journalist, pointed out, that on 3 occasions the Taliban offered to hand over Osama Bin Laden for trial, to face trial on charges they organised the 9/11 bombing. And on 3 occasions they were turned down by the Americans because the Americans were determined to see a military solution to this question.